Okay, let's just set the scene. I sort of wanted to sort of position, dare I say, where the market is heading, where the market is at now. And there's a couple of ways of doing that, and the next slide will show you. There's what's known as from Gartner the hype cycles. They do one for a general technology. Across many different areas, so they talk about when we're going to get flying cars, and obviously we've already got drone deliveries and things like that. So there's a general technology one, and what you'll find interestingly is even in the general broader sense, there's a number of topics or themes that Gartner are pretty adamant are coming our way. And some of those, which I know it's a little bit difficult to possibly read there on the screen, but like I said, we'll provide these slides. They talk about knowledge graphs. They talk about graph analytics. So there's a number of fields there, which again, I'm not sure people would naturally think were related to enterprise architecture, but they are. And we'll come to explain how we see that. And indeed, Abacus approaches things using a lot of those technologies. Another area that's pretty interesting is what they're referring to as synthetic data, or data, if you're American or English, I guess. And so again, we'll talk a lot about what we mean by that. But yet, in the broader sense, there are some emerging tech that's really coming our way, and we all need to keep our eye on. And of course, us as a vendor are looking to exploit that going forward. But when we move into one of the specific hype cycles, which you can see there on the right, is all about what they refer to as the digital workplace. So this is where people are, of course, we're all collaborating around the world. We're using technologies like Slack and Microsoft Teams to do our work. And so once we're actually using a digital platform to collaborate and to work, we are actually capturing a lot of the digital understanding of our business already and automatically. And to us, that's actually what we define as the digital business. You've digitized your business and you're using a workplace platform to do a lot of that. And within there, again, that hype cycle, it talks a lot about sort of different analytics approaches and fundamentally a concept which is often referred to as democratized or citizen-driven EA. Okay, so it's where you're pushing out the responsibility. I saw my microphone muted on me. Sorry about that. I don't know why. Yeah, so that area of democratized EA is something that I think is really interesting, and that whole decentralization of it, and we'll talk more about that. So, yeah, next slide. We've sort of tried to break this up into a couple of little focus areas. Now, there's a report by Harvey Nash. We'll provide you the link to that later. It's a great report that sort of tries to it interviews a lot of CIOs all around the world and gets their kind of position statements on things and see where they're prioritizing. Can everyone just make sure they mute their microphone? Sorry, someone's got some background noise there. Okay, so what we try to do is quickly just summarize that for you guys here. And there's a few areas. That first one we're sort of using is, like a weather forecast. We're talking about, cloudy with a chance of hybrid. What that sort of is referring to is, there's been a big push to go to the cloud for everybody, but that's not an exclusive thing. We're finding there's a lot of people who still want to have on-premise stuff, okay, whether it's from a data privacy point of view or a security point of view. That's still a demand out there. A lot of the government agencies and things, even with the the government cloud and stuff like that, a lot of people are requiring things to be on-prem. So fundamentally, there's going to be a hybrid going forward, and that's okay. We're sympathetic to that. We don't think everything should be in the cloud necessarily. It's only where it's appropriate, which sort of is a good segue into the next one. The whole cybersecurity area, of course, everyone knows is a big topic indeed. The survey showed that it was 14% more important to CIOs going into this year. So cybersecurity, and we've done a number of presentations about that. Indeed, one of our clients, Sophos, did a really good presentation about that. So hit us up and we can provide you the link to that seminar as well. Data privacy in Europe, there was the big GDPR milestone happened last year, but it hasn't gone away. It's obviously, it's just now starting to get enforced, and there's some new regulations that are coming in America as well. So data privacy and of course, PII and all that sort of stuff that is all around the world is a continuing focus for companies. The bottom left one there where it talks about self-service EA, that is that citizen-driven one. It's about saying, look, we need to collaborate on this. We're a team. Let's not be ivory tower about this. Architects are trusted advisors. Architects should be people that are collaborating with their colleagues, and indeed the colleagues are the ones who own the information. So give them access to that information. Let them own it. Let them maintain it easily, and work alongside them to provide good guidance. How do you provide that guidance? Of course, through analytics. Otherwise, things are just subjective. So, we're big believers in using metrics and KPIs to guide all these decision making. So, people will often talk about impact analysis as a thing, and it's pretty limited to just see that as a visual, connectivity problem. Impact analysis can be measured, and you can come up with numbers, okay, and you can put costs to things and actual KPIs. So Gartner talks about that as business outcome driven. So you need to have KPIs, things that are defensible and actually measurable. Now, unfortunately, though, things are not getting easier. You can't make complex things simple, but you hope to be able to make them understood. Okay, so we do a lot of work to try to find, the kind of insights and the valuable things within, an enormous portfolio of information. So being able to manage complexity is an ongoing priority that we all need to be sympathetic to. That relates to how do you visualize things? Obviously you can't just give people a spreadsheet with 10,000 cells in it. That's just going to be lost. So we've done a lot of work about visualization, and again, Andrew will sort of walk you through that, and different ways of course showing roadmaps, not just the the ubiquitous Gantt chart. With that, I think I'll pass to you, Andrew. Hopefully that audio's come across okay. And like I say, we will have a recording to provide to people afterwards. So take it away.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tim. As Tim just mentioned, if audio is an issue, please do let us know. I've got people around the room giving me a thumbs up that they can hear me, which is always a good sign. So we'll move on through the slides. The idea, I guess, for the next 30 or 40 minutes is just to take you through some of the key road mapping concepts that we utilize in ABACUS, through various features that we have and through various styles of visualization. And we have done extensive road mapping webinars before. Some of you might have been on those as well. So you'll probably hear me reference a few of these webinars that we've done throughout the demonstration and throughout some of these slides. So please feel free to email us if you want access to some of those previous recordings that we have as well. Now, the first, I guess, step is almost scoping type of roadmaps that you're actually going to be creating. So whether that's in ABACUS, of course, and traditionally that might have been done outside of ABACUS through things like PowerPoints, but typically one of the best places to start is usually at the end. What is it that you actually want to try and achieve? So you need to start asking yourself what kind of information, metrics, or KPIs are going to be one of those most powerful ways of informing and potentially, of course, influencing any decisions. Now, ideally, and something that you will see a lot throughout these slides, is a mixture of how we can actually represent some of that through the dashboards. So you'll see as I go through some of these slides, those dashboards that we're going to be creating, we'll start taking a look at some of the core KPIs and metrics, and of course, best ways of visualizing those as well. You'll see here, of course, we've mentioned what type of elements might be included on the slides as well. And those things, as you can see, are things like services, projects, programs, systems. Anything that you want to manage can also be displayed throughout the standard visualizations, and of course, key things that you'd be wanting to adhere to as well. I can see there are just roughly a few questions here on the audio. So one thing I will just do as a quick check, I realize we are going through the slides here, so let me just double check my audio settings very quickly. Perfect. So one thing I will do is, as Tim mentioned, obviously the slides are recorded, so don't worry if the audio has dropped out too much, and hopefully everyone can see it. It's way better, so that's good. So just to reiterate, I guess, on this slide as an overall, the idea is to start at the end. What is it that you want to achieve, and how are we actually going to get there? Now, I mentioned that we've done these road mapping WebExes before, and typically what that tends to do is fall into what we typically call the 4 types of roadmaps. Now, the first thing you'll see in here is some kind of strategic recommendation that we might apply. And that typically falls into a capability of heat mapping different views that you're going to be producing in ABACUS. And you'll see some real world examples of these too. The second type there is the lifecycle charts. Typically, when we start thinking about roadmaps, of course, we want to provide some kind of strategic direction, but usually there's some element of time involved as well. Where are we now? Where are we hopefully going to be in the next 3, 6, or 12 months' time? And that could be timescales, they could be projects, they could be phases within different programs. All of those typically will try to adhere to some kind of timeline. The third and fourth here, and the third typically is looking at more traditional programs and projects, or what you'll find in other frameworks like Archimate and TOGAF is some kind of work package concept. The delivery vehicle, essentially. How are we actually going to be making these changes? So we typically start with the what, the when, and then the how. And then type 4 is one of the key concepts that you would, hopefully some of you on the call would have seen in Abacus itself, is this concept of multiple architectures. So you can quite easily build up future state views, future phases, options of projects, and then actually start comparing those to each other. And we'll deep dive a bit more towards the end through what we typically classify as scenario analysis through the use of multiple architectures. So you'll get, again, a bit more of a real world example of how that works. The other key thing here, I guess, is some of the success factors that we typically use to underpin some of these roadmaps. Typically, if we're going to put ourselves in the shoes of any EA, you're about to present this information to a CIO, you need to walk through some of these examples. What you really need are some success factors. And typically what you'll see through the next few slides is how we can actually start presenting that through different dashboards and how those might align to different use cases that you have as well. So road mapping, a relatively general term, it can be applied in many contexts, but what you will find are some key examples through Abacus on how you can actually start building these and start communicating these types of views or recommendations much more effectively. So what do those actually look like? Well, initially what we would typically try and do in Abacus is build up these dashboard-based views. Now, dashboards, again, are effectively a collection of different views in Abacus. And the key idea is to start tailoring these to the audience that's going to be looking at it. So if you take something like a technology planning roadmap, that might be a combination of a whole bunch of different views, trying to understand things like the server hardware, the end of life of the technology, the end of support of the technology as well. And this is typically how you're going to be building up some of those dashboards. The key thing to remember here, of course, is the data that drives these views is, of course, going to be coming from other sources. So whether you do want to import things from ServiceNow, if you're integrating to things like Technopedia, they are great resources for pulling data into Abacus. Abacus can then act as that hub to then build these specific views. And again, from here, you're trying to drive decisions. What technologies are we actually going to be changing? What are the recommended technologies to use internally? How do we identify new technologies or new tech stacks? And that can be done through some of these dashboards. Another key example is something like technical debt. So again, some of you might have been on some of the other technical debt WebExes we've done previously. Well, again, we'll send those links through. And we do talk extensively there on the key concepts of tech debt. But really what we're trying to do here is understand both tech debt from a technology perspective, but also trying to roll that up to some kind of cost metric. When we talk extensively around tech debt in terms of the code that's being used behind the scenes, the platforms, the new technology that's being used, that's fine from a technical perspective. But from a business perspective, we actually want to see what is the value of moving away from old technology or adopting new technology. And that's typically where we start focusing on some of these cost metrics. And again, it gives us some level of prioritizing which systems we should be working on. And in reality, again, these dashboards, they are just there to provide a single page of trying to analyze all of these other metrics that are on the screen. Another quite interesting one, I guess, is something that's always thrown around in terms of business and IT alignment. Really what we're trying to show here is how we can, again, pull that up, not just from a metrics-based approach, but in terms of the objects you might be modeling within a tool. So if we are starting to think of things like application lists or systems or services, we typically might want to bring that up a level to some kind of business capability map or a process model. As much as we might be recommending some technology changes, the impact of those changes are then going to affect those processes that they're supporting. And again, the key aspect of using these and why these things tend to work is that they're there for decision makers. You're able to quickly see an overview of effectively an application landscape or a process view. And the idea is that, again, these are providing some kind of insights into your data that notoriously might have been quite difficult to get from, as Tim mentioned, a list of 10,000 rows in an Excel spreadsheet. A key thing to point out here, and we will delve again into this a bit later on, is that some of the concepts and some of the values that we're showing, of course, are driven through algorithms. The ability to be able to drill down into these, to be able to aggregate that data, that's one of the key differentiators that Abacus has in this space, which is to use these algorithms to make people's jobs easier, and of course, to then start suggesting different values for different attributes or properties. So typically, from all the dashboards, we are just trying to push for a much more of a self-service environment, trying to remove the burden on some of the EAs and to make sure there's a single stop for anyone who wants to visualize or see this data. Now, this particular view, I guess, is something that's worth mentioning because so far we've kind of seen some of the example dashboards. And that's in ABACUS Enterprise, and it's effectively an environment that is much more dynamic. So you would have seen through some of those views, you'll see some live views later on, where we can actually start drilling down into those. There is, however, of course, a need of also producing what we might typically classify as these static views. And again, this is a particular one coming from one of the exports that you can produce in PowerPoint decks or PDF documents. There's still going to be a need for those. You can still extract that information, but these views are still going to be key. More importantly, for this particular view, what you're also seeing are the levels of interdependencies. So as much as we might be creating those dashboards for specific domains, the idea, of course, is that you do want to see the scope of where things are affecting each other. So where there are applications that are maybe hosted on servers that are being retired, or technologies coming to end of life, or projects reaching a certain stage in the phase. These, again, are the ideas of showing roadmaps not just on one object, but all of the connections that impact those changes. And again, from a lifecycle dates perspective, or from a timing perspective, those metrics are going to be key to understand the impact. Again, going through those phases of what, when, how, and why. One of the final examples that you'll see in here is coming back, I guess, a bit more into the details of those multiple architectures or scenario-based analysis. So we've tried to provide some kind of strategic direction. We've given some kind of timeline to justify some of the changes that we're going to be making. But then these scenarios allow you to analyze different metrics or KPIs. So we might be looking at things like the complexity of our model, maybe how we're reducing cost through different projects, maybe how certain systems are becoming more reliable. We might start talking about things like regulation, compliance, security, and much more these days, things like operational resilience. These are key terms that are going to be used in Abacus to help drive these scenarios. So once you do manage to capture what you look like today, these scenarios are going to enable you to move forward and decide, what are we going to look like after a specific project? Is that project worthwhile? Should we pivot to move around to some other way? So that's going to be one of the key areas of using these scenarios to start analyzing the outcomes of any changes that you're planning. Again, picking one quick topic here in terms of tech debt, because we have done extensive detail around this and extensive webinars. It's one of the key things to take into consideration because these things tend to fall into other areas that you might be considering, such as things like governance, the principles that you apply to your models, the guidelines around how these roadmaps might be produced. And the idea is that these roadmaps and hopefully some of the visualizations and tools that we can offer will help reach some of those areas. And from a tech debt perspective, it's one of those huge things these days when we start thinking about things like shadow IT even. These are the things that are typically impacting day-to-day operations. So typically you might want to start focusing on some of those key areas and then moving through these transition phases over time. Again, Using services like Technopedia and ServiceNow will help you establish some kind of baseline. Abacus is then going to hopefully move you towards these future states that you're trying to achieve. Now that was, I guess, a quick recap to some extent on some of the work we've done on road mapping in general. The key thing I do want to start talking about is how we can actually leverage some of the key things that have been developed in Abacus 7 to try and achieve those roadmaps in more of an easier sense, make these things more efficient, and hopefully start showing you some views that you might not yet have seen. So let's see what's new. There are quite a few, let's say, features that are new in Abacus. Any features that you'll see me going through today are typically there for a specific purpose. And you'll see how each of these do tend to tie back to some of the roadmap success factors and the types of roadmaps that we've touched on so far. Now, you'll see in here, we've got things like interactive roadmaps, we've got machine learning concepts. We've always, of course, got the idea of running algorithms to start predicting some of these values or calculating some of these values. And that's going to be a key thread throughout most of the work that we do. If we take a look at one of the first views in here, that is typically what we're calling some kind of interactive Gantt chart. Now, because roadmaps, of course, are a constant requirement, they're never really going to go away, we've tried to produce something that's a bit more extensive than just a standard document that you produce. We're trying to produce something that's much more, let's say, interactive and much more intuitive to go through. So this interactive Gantt chart typically shows you things like the lifecycle dates, which you're seeing on the screen here, across any object. So whether it's things like lifecycle dates of the applications, the projects, the technology underneath, and how that might be aggregating up to these processes, programs, or capabilities. The key aspect to mention here again, coming back to the algorithms, is even if you don't have lifecycle dates on things like capabilities or processes, being able to aggregate those up and down the stack, up and down those relationships that you've created, is going to be key to filling in some of those blanks as well. Now, the key benefit that you'll get from Gantt chart is because, of course, all this is in browser, it's pretty much live. So any data change that you make, these charts are going to reflect that data, which is, of course, continuously changing. So whenever someone needs to track something, so project changes, change management, new requests, new tech stack changes, this Gantt view is pretty much going to give you an instant answer to any question that you have, without what traditionally happens these days, I guess, is building PowerPoint slides. You build a PowerPoint slide manually, it's pretty much out of date the next day, and you have to go through that long process of rebuilding those every time. Making these available to any user, all within their browser, all interactive and dynamic, and taking a look at live data means that they can make slightly more informed decisions rather than working off old, maybe historical data. The next view, or the next feature to start utilizing, I guess, is graph view. Graph view, to be honest, falls into a few different categories of use. There are two main ones, I guess. And the first is probably the idea of trying to understand, which you'll see on this view here, some of the complexity around different areas. So, for example, we can drill down into things like departments, locations, servers, and actually start understanding the complexity behind the scenes. So that's the idea of trying to gain some kind of 10,000-foot view of the architecture. Now, also, graph view is used in another manner as more of an exploratory view. So typically you'll have users who might not necessarily want to start drawing diagrams manually. They also might not know the data too well. So this graph view is actually based on any data that you have within the tool. And of course, the two basic concepts of there are objects and the relationships between those objects. This graph view is automatically going to be produced based on that data. So it's as simple as uploading an Excel spreadsheet, let's say, and then you'll automatically have some kind of graph view available to you. So making this as an exploratory view means people can actually navigate through that model. They can start understanding dependencies. They can actually start seeing, for example, applications that they use to support specific processes, and how maybe the department down the road is using a completely different application. insights that they might not have had before because they might have just been working on their own local views. This is now trying to enable a wider audience to get involved. So it's dynamic, it's intuitive, you just click through these objects and you can actually drill down into as many levels as you like. So it should, in theory, and we've seen this across many customers, enable much more of a transparent way of working. And because you'll have certain users that want to view this data in different ways, you can, of course, customize all of these views. So if you did tend to use a specific notation within Abacus, you might want to use a different notation for these graph views. Again, we'll show you some more live examples towards the end as well. The third feature, I guess, is something that is probably quite difficult to tie into enterprise architecture initially. And it's, I guess, trying to explain the unexplainable, let's say. And it's one of those concepts which I think most of us have heard of, let's say. So machine learning is typically something that we might come across maybe unknowingly pretty much every day of our lives. A few, I guess, quick examples there are things like Amazon. They use machine learning for showing you trustworthy reviews, as much as they might have had some flack recently about that. You have people like PayPal using it for transactional fraud detection. Hotels benefit from kind of customer-specific pricing. So machine learning is something that's already out there. It's been used for quite some time, and it is something that generally is maybe less tied to EA. However, the benefit that we see is really trying to take some of the guesswork out of some of the business decisions that you actually start making. The insights from machine learning really are there to assist and to start predicting on these real-time models different directions that you might be moving into. So for you EAs, what that really means is it's trying to enable a bit more insight into the data. You already have an existing baseline. Machine learning will now start suggesting other areas. Is this system a hotspot? Does this system seem to be used much? Maybe there are two systems that always behave in a related fashion. So Abacus might suggest that they might become the same system. So those are all topics that machine learning is trying to delve into. But bringing that back to some of the basics, what you typically end up with, or typically maybe start with, let's say, is this kind of gap within the data. So you probably have spreadsheets that you're trying to work off. You probably have quite a few empty cells that you're trying to get people to fill in. And of course, you can use some of the methods in enterprise to kind of gamify some of this data and encourage people to fill in the data. But inevitably, you are going to get situations like this where there are gaps within that data. Now, machine learning simply takes a minimum number of records. And again, that can be set by any user in Abacus. And what we're trying to do is start suggesting what those values should be. Now, the key differentiator here between machine learning and algorithms is that machine learning is usually what we classify as something that's non-deterministic. And algorithms is something that's deterministic. So we're specifically building an algorithm for a specific output. Machine learning is really there to try and suggest what these values should be and to try and essentially accelerate kind of the data inputs or data quality that you have as well. What typically happens through that machine learning process is it will start reading all of the columns, all of the values, all of the relationships that you have, and then it will start suggesting what those values could be. So again, of course, we're not trying to take let's say the control away from any enterprise architects here or anyone else who's using Abacus. Machine learning is purely a suggestion engine. It's trying to recommend what these values could be. And you'll see that quite evidently from some of the values that come up here. So for example, disaster recovery, we can probably reliably see some of these values coming through. And there will be some threshold, there'll be some kind of confidence interval that we apply, and we can decide if we want to accept those values or not. It will also suggest maybe relationships that should be created, not just properties or attributes. Again, another key thing just to reiterate, of course, is that some of these values are going to be best calculated using some kind of objective or deterministic algorithm. And that's certainly one of the areas that we've put a lot of effort into. And some of you on the call might have already used some of these algorithms in Abacus. Now, algorithms in general, the key concepts here is the ability to traverse up and down any model. So that's in terms of some kind of hierarchy structure or parent-child, and of course across, so through all the relationships that you've actually built within the model. Algorithms in general can fall into many categories. You might already be using algorithms internally. Whether you know it or not, it's quite likely that the algorithms are being used for calculating things like forecasts, budgets, etc. Those might be some of the cost algorithms that you're building. However, you can tailor those algorithms in Abacus to represent different formats as well. So you might be looking at things like risk, maybe impact assessments. Again, we talked about tech debt earlier on. That might be something that you're looking at in terms of where are there certain systems that are more vulnerable or at higher risk, potentially because they're still hosted on old operating systems. Maybe stuff is still using Windows 7 and there's no migration plan in place. And again, these algorithms are going to help start building up a view of what things could look like. Again, coming back to those roadmap concepts. That's the transition phase effectively between your current state views and your target state views. But those algorithms are going to help you objectively measure how you get from one state to another. They become quite relevant as well in today's market for things like regulatory compliance. If you are trying to determine how compliant your architecture, your application landscape is, your databases, your data models, you can start building up these algorithms and start proving that as much as 80% of our applications are currently compliant. Take a look at this roadmap that we produced, and we're effectively forecasting that will be 95% compliance in 12 months' time. So they are going to be there to help start predicting, start calculating, and start building up some of these values that you might traditionally have found difficult to achieve. One thing you will see here is the ease of use through these algorithms. So we typically classify these algorithms as no code. What we really mean by that is, as much as you might want to, or you certainly can write code in Abacus, we want to move this into an area where anyone can start building these as easily as possible. So what you're seeing here is a level of us building blocks by dragging and dropping those onto that canvas. And we're effectively saying, get me a list of all the applications that we have. Let's take a look at the business capability map on the right-hand side to see which applications are supporting those. And now let's aggregate some of the recommendation or the strategic values that we've aligned through those applications and roll those up to this process or capability level. So this idea of aggregating those values means that traditionally we might not have known what kind of strategic direction each process or capability might be heading in. But we can quite effectively calculate that through 4 blocks on here and roll that up from those applications. Now again, the idea here is to move away from what might traditionally be subjective measures. The kind of rule of thumb here is, if you give someone a list of applications or systems that they own, ask them to rate them how critical they are, I guarantee they will all come back saying highly critical. The idea here is to move away from those subjective views and then objectively start capturing that detail. Maybe those systems are used by one person. Maybe it's not supporting any processes and it's contributing to 30% of our IT budget. We might consider then through the algorithms that that particular application is not highly critical based on its limited use, based on the fact that it's not supporting anything internally. So we can start using these drivers to make some changes then. Now, one of the final key areas that we've done quite a bit of work on recently is to try and, of course, communicate this information. So we've talked about building the dashboards in Enterprise, how that means there's a single source, effectively a one-stop shop for anyone who wants to see this information. Of course, that's going to be relatively useless if you can't communicate that much more effectively. So we've worked extensively on bedding something like ABACUS Enterprise into Microsoft Teams, which is what you're seeing on the screen here, into other tools through things like Confluence. These are some of the areas that people are already using. So you can start reducing that barrier to entry for a significant proportion of your users. Embed this in existing tools. You'll see even from the comments here, you don't even have to make it look like an enterprise architecture tool. And the idea, of course, is that it's a collaborative environment. So you'll see even as we start editing some of the data, we can see that there are other people in that data set at the same time. Other people are amending, maybe adding, maybe even removing some of these ideas that we have in this list. And the idea is that you can all be working at the same time. And some of the other key aspects here is making sure that you can communicate effectively. So within Abacus, you can actually start a conversation with anyone if that username is in that list, and you can immediately strike up a conversation using something like Teams or Skype or any other kind of internal system you use to communicate. And that means you don't have to go through this kind of swivel chair procedure. The other key aspect here, of course, is some extent to update this information with higher levels of data quality. If there are more people seeing this data, if more people have access to it, if they may be seeing that there are values that are incorrect, you're trying to empower them a bit more to make changes that they can easily do live, rather than thinking it's a difficult stage of having to export content, fill in surveys, get those approved, filled back into the tool, and then export it to a system that they can use. All of this is one place. And because those dashboards are live, as you make those changes, of course, you're going to realize that those views are going to be updated at the same time. Now, I realize, as usual, time tends to go against us on these WebExes. We have probably about 10, 15 minutes left, but one thing I do want to quickly do is just jump into Enterprise just to take you through some of the dashboards that we've shown, because we've given you a quick overview, I guess, through some of the slides. But what I do want to quickly flag up on the screen here is how you might actually start using Enterprise in this live environment. So what you're seeing here, Enterprise in browser, we've incorporated, of course, stuff like single sign-on, so there's not much need for me to remember any username and passwords at all. And the idea, of course, again, is that anyone could be working in here. So all of these objects are pretty much live and looking at this core Abacus file. And you'll see how these dashboards that you'll see on the left-hand side can then be tailored to different areas. So for example, you might have things like risk dashboards, you might have a specific GDPR dashboard for different users, and you might want to tailor, of course, who can see these as well. And the idea behind Enterprise is maybe more so these days to move away from what you might classify as these traditional architecture views. So this capability map on the left-hand side, this boxes within boxes approach, and move to something that's a bit more dynamic. So enabling people to drill down into each capability, understand in this instance how we're managing customer service, and then eventually get to a bottom level where we're seeing the systems that support each of those processes. And again, of course, we can do that through a graph view instead. So for example, if we were only interested in some of the operating processes in here, we can see what capabilities are in that particular grouping. We can again maybe take a look at how we are delivering the services. Those services are made up of different processes and requirements. Those processes in turn are then made up of a whole array of different applications and departments and services that build upon those processes. So you can quite easily start navigating through all of this data. That's one of the key things about Enterprise, is allowing users to build up these models much more dynamically than dragging and dropping and drawing diagrams. All of this data is then going to be at their fingertips. And again, the idea is to start, of course, building these dashboards with different audiences, different stakeholders, and maybe different objectives or requirements you have. So things like GDPR dashboards, showing things like security classification around the data that you hold, whether certain systems contain PII content. These are, again, going to be tailored for different audiences. And again, some of these you'll obviously recognize from these slides, but making these dynamic is important. And from a roadmap perspective, as we mentioned earlier on, having these views updatable and automatically updating based on any inputs, whether it's manual, whether it's algorithm-based, whether we're pulling in content from ServiceNow or Technopedia or any other source, you're making sure that users have that ability of moving through this information easily, understanding the capabilities, how they're built up of different processes, and how those processes might be supported by different applications. So in general, that's where we're focusing, if you like, on building much more dynamic environments, making it easy for people to get access to this data, but also making it easy for them to be owners of that data so that they have the ability to update and, of course, recommend then potential changes that need to be made throughout the model. Again, I appreciate the time again is probably not the best situation for us. So what we will do is we'll move on to some of the questions that are coming through. So I can see there are quite a few coming through. But one thing I do want to quickly reiterate on one of the slides here, and Tim I think mentioned this earlier on. We've done many WebExes and webinars before, and you'll see that we have a cloud migration one coming up. So you will find that we'll have very specific and tailored demonstrations as well. So please feel free, of course, to come along to those. If there's anything or any specific topic in mind that you have or want to see, please let us know, because it's quite likely we've recorded and can send you some more collateral on that as well. But again, based on time, I think we've probably got a few minutes to go through some of the questions that have been coming through. Tim, I don't know if you want to facilitate going through some of those. I can see that you've actually been answering some of those as I've been going through the slides as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. Yep, so I've tried my best to keep up with everyone. So quick sound check, Andrew, you can hear me okay, I presume?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Yeah, great. So yeah, I've tried my best to keep up with them, and there's been lots of great questions about various things. There's one current open one that I'll probably try and address around, how does this all fit with Agile? But yeah, some of the common threads, people were asking for access to this sample data. So yep, if you register for a trial online through the website, the support team will send you a link, and you can get in and start playing with the content. So not necessarily all of the content that Andrew's been showing, because some of those are sort of custom projects we've got, but there's definitely various sample data out there that you can play with and do some of this for yourself. People have asked questions about, do we support Archimate? Do we support TOGAF? So yes, we definitely support all those. There's a frameworks page on our website where we list all the different frameworks that we support. And when it comes particularly to the graph view that you were showing, Andrew, do you want to, I tried to answer it in line in the things, but there was obviously lots of different notations you were showing there. So how does that work? Like, how do you set up what the icons, the notations are when you're doing graph view? You want to just sort of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So the question there, I guess, in terms of the graph views that we've been showing, and what I'll do is I'll actually go through that process just to show you what that looks like, is when we build one of these graph views in Abacus, what we can actually do is choose one of these viewpoints, or think of them as stencils that we're going to be using. So for example, if you're using Archimate, you'll see the various notations that Archimate will have. What you're seeing here, of course, is our example notation. And so ideally what you're going to be doing is choosing some of these viewpoints in terms of the style and the style of the shapes that people want to see. From an Archimate perspective, the key area, I guess, why we focus a bit more on graph view and on some of the other notations is Archimate is a great facilitator or notation for some of those architecture views that you're going to be creating. And of course, there's close alignment there to things like TOGAF and of course extended from UML. Those types of views are what we might typically think of as architectural style views. Enterprise, you might want to start shifting to more of let's say, a business friendly view, where you still use the Archimate concepts in tool. However, to display that content, you might be using some of these other views and notations. So you might be using something like a graph dots approach, where yes, behind the scenes, it's all Archimate content, but for different stakeholders, for different users, they're seeing something less, let's say, architecturally styled, and something that's maybe a bit more business intelligence friendly. However, of course, the graph views can use any notation that you define within the tool.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just elaborate on that. And it's a sort of interesting concept to get your head around, but the separation between the model or the repository, and that means as Andrew's talking about the content versus the view. Okay, so you can make hybrid frameworks where you might use a meta model from something like TOGAF, but then you might overlay a BPMN and an Archimate notation on top of that. So we've talked about this, and we talk about the Frankenstein problem, where you end up having just such a plethora of things that people get a bit lost, but also appreciate you might have two different stakeholder groups who want to look at exactly the same content but in a different way. Okay, so that's all possible, and you can use role-based access to do that. Needless to say, Abacus is highly configurable. You can choose you can import your Visio shapes, you can author your own shapes. So be careful not to get too caught up in that. We have lots of ones off the shelf that you should use, and that one like the graph dots that Andrew showed. We're trying to sort of make people take a bit of a step back and just see this as it's just a visualization. It's obviously very important, but it's just a way of seeing things. People might prefer to see things in a list. Obviously a graph is a great way of visualizing stuff, but don't get too caught up in that. But yep, so you certainly can go wall to wall Archimate if you want, with the Archimate meta model, the Archimate notation and all that. Something to remember though is Archimate has no attributes. So unless you start to augment Archimate with attributes, which of course we've done, you're going to be pretty limited in the sort of visualizations you can do. So sorry, let's park that there. Okay, the big other open one, which sorry, I've got a bit lost because there's been more questions coming in while I was doing that, but around agile. So Andrew, do you want to sort of make some little quick quick comments around, you've got a team, they're madly flying along doing their sprint, they haven't got time to do, and we've been sort of debating about what the term documentation means, they haven't got time to sort of, record what they're doing. Do you want to sort of make some comments about how, enterprise can be sympathetic to, people who ever, dare I say, the attention span of a goldfish, if you remember there was another presentation we did about that, 8 seconds, wasn't it? I think.
Yes, yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I think one of the key, I guess, areas for enterprise is we kind of want to make it easy for people. So when we think about the ways that people interact with systems and how they update that data, we want to try and make sure that they have that pretty much at their fingertips. And again, the idea of embedding that into the systems like Confluence or Teams means that they don't have to go to yet another system to make those changes. So the idea of embedding Abacus into those areas means that you might just give someone a list of applications, let's say. You might only limit this to 1 or 2 columns. This is all role-based access, keep in mind. So as they log in, they'll only, of course, see the applications that are maybe relevant to them. And the idea then is that they can quickly come in here and start making those changes. They don't have to wait around for anyone to configure these systems. They can quite easily change any of the properties or any of the data in here. So we're trying to make that as easy as possible. The other key aspect in here, of course, is some of the chat functionalities that you might have. Because if they do run into any issues, at least if there's some kind of usernames in here that you'll be working on, you can instantly then start a conversation with those users. Or set up things like email alerts or notifications so that you start prompting people to make changes, or when applications pass a specific review date that they have to come into the system to make those changes. It's all trying to make it as a centralized location to make any data inputs without, more traditionally, working off Excel spreadsheets that tend to become quite frustrating if they're out of date. No one knows who last accessed or who last changed something. So of course, Abacus will maintain all of those audit trails and versionings directly in the tool for you. But again, making it easily accessible, maybe just giving someone a URL, maybe even sending them a filtered URL so you can save these and send them on as well. Or even just searching for things in enterprise. That's a traditional problem. If I want to make some changes to a CRM system, well, I don't really know where that is, so let's just search for it and let's see which architectures it's in, what views it appears on, and I can make changes in those areas. So again, trying to make things much more efficient, much more streamlined for people who might not know all the details.
Okay, I think we're probably done, are we, time-wise? Sorry, I know I was typing there with my mic on, so apologies if that was a bit funky for people. But so that's, I think we scheduled 50 minutes, didn't we, Andrew, for people? So
yeah, we did. Again, I can see there's some other questions coming through, so don't worry, everyone. If you haven't had your question answered, we will follow up, of course, with everyone on any unanswered ones.
That's right. We keep a record of that. And like I say, we're recording the session, so we'll provide a link to all that. I'm not sure if that includes the question and answer part, but either way, we've obviously got all that as well. So thank you, I guess, everyone. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. It started a day here in the US. It's the end of the day, I presume, in Europe. It's middle of the night in Asia, so I don't know if we'll have anyone there. But look, thank you, everyone. And
thanks for your time, everyone.